Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us to the Association of Colleges of the Sisters of St. Joseph's National Gathering, hosted virtually by St. Catherine University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Our conference theme this year is Meeting the Needs of the Time. I'm so glad that you are joining us today and joining nearly 300 colleagues from across the country from our member campuses, CSSJ high schools, Sisters of St. Joseph, and other friends. My name is Martha Malinsky, and I am the Executive Director of the Association of Colleges of the Sisters of St. Joseph, or ACSSJ. The association draws together 9 colleges and universities founded by the Sisters of St. Joseph to articulate and further the contemporary expression of the educational mission and legacy of the Sisters of St. Joseph. The association fosters collaboration among all of our member institutions: Avila University, Chestnut Hill College, Elms College, Fontbonne University, Mount St. Mary's University, Regis College, St. Catherine University, St. Joseph's College, and the College of St. Rose. Obviously, doing a virtual national gathering is a little different. We've practiced this many times to ensure the next few days go smoothly, but please remember, technology sometimes has its issues. If this happens, please bear with us and provide us with grace and courtesy. All participants are currently on mute. Please keep yourself on mute until the reception in just a few hours. We know that one of the special things about the national gathering is getting to see and know colleagues. Please keep your camera on as much as possible. And if you feel like it, you can add your name and college or school or organization so we can get to know you. If you have a technical issue, simply put something in the chat box to the right of your screen. Thank you to all those at St. Catherine University who are doing all the behind the scenes tech support. Finally, this program is being recorded and will be available on our website. I want to first thank our 9 member universities and our sponsors whose financial support has made this national gathering possible. Thank you to the St. Paul Province of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet and Consociates, St. Joseph Educational Ministries, Los Angeles Province of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, Academium, the U.S. Federation of the Sisters of St. Joseph, Sisters of St. Joseph of Springfield, Albany Province of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, Sisters of St. Joseph of Boston. We are so pleased that many of you are able to join us for this conference today. Thank you again for your sponsorship. Now I'd like to introduce you to Don Boomgaarden, Board Chair of the Association of Colleges of the Sisters of St. Joseph and President of St. Joseph's College in New York.
Thank you, Martha. I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. My name is Don Boomgaarden. I'm the president of St. Joseph's College of New York. And on behalf of the directors of the Association of Colleges of Sisters of St. Joseph, I want to welcome you to the national gathering. Before I turn it over to Becky Roloff, president of St. Catherine, I want to first thank her and her staff for hosting this national gathering. And I think it's especially important right now during the times of challenge that we're facing, and also the time of change that we're facing. Each school in our association has a unique personality, a unique mission and approach, but all of us share common bonds and a common history, going all the way back to the 17th century. A fascination with the joy of learning, but also learning for practical intent. And so all of us are moving forward individually, but also collectively, trying to meet the needs of the time. We're here together to support one another, to develop really strong bonds, and to grow through inclusive love, reconciliation, and unity. And in the words of Jean-Pierre Médaille, we are here to dream the dream that God dreams for us. So I'm looking forward to President Roloff's talk. I'm looking forward to the rest of our wonderful national gathering and welcome all of you to this event. I also want to thank Martha for her really hard work to make all of this possible as well, and for everyone that's been involved in making this a really special occasion. So from me to you, thank you so much. And I'll turn this now over to President Roloff.
Thank you, Don and Martha. And good morning and welcome to you all. I'm Becky Roloff, President of St. Catherine University, and it's my distinct pleasure to offer St. Catherine University as the host for this virtual gathering of our colleges and universities and our high schools. I'm standing in Our Lady of Victory Chapel, and I'm imagining all of you are in front of me in our beautiful chapel, which is the heart of St. Catherine University. We begin our program with honor and respect for Indigenous people and the land. We are on the ancestral homeland of the Dakota people and the Anishinaabe and other Native communities who have a very long history, past, present, and future, with this sacred land. We desire to honor and respect the Indigenous people and recognize their care for their home and for ours. We, both personally and institutionally, continue to have a deepening awareness of our complicity, of the complex history of colonialism and broken treaties. We seek to understand the troubled acquisition of this land by unjust U.S. government practices, which include building on the homeland of the Dakota people and their forced removal from these lands, which did not include any compensation to the Native communities. We acknowledge the past, current, and future impacts of this history on our relationship with our Native sisters and brothers. In our commitment to social justice and the love of dear neighbor without distinction, we are called to acknowledge and to deepen our understanding of our participation in these interlocking systems of oppression. We seek to journey farther together, to respond boldly in working toward dismantling them. We, St. Catherine University and the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet and Consociates, know that these humble words are inadequate, imperfect, and must extend beyond this verbal acknowledgement. This is only our beginning of a much larger journey of listening, learning, building relationship, and importantly, advocating for and with Native nations for a more just world of all. At St. Catherine, our mission is to educate women to lead and to influence. It's a mission passed down to us from our fathers, from our founders, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, and one we have proudly carried forward since 1905. Due to our wonderful experience with this gathering at Regis University in 2019, both the Provost, Dr. Anita Thomas, and I knew that this opportunity to host this education think tank would bring forward the ongoing process of growth, development, and celebration of the legacy and Sisters of St. Joseph. With this as our focus, let us begin with this prayer.
Good morning, and welcome to this holy space, where we gather together for prayer as a community from near and far. It is good that we are here this day to mark the beginning of our gathering of the colleges of the Sisters of St. Joseph.
Today, we give thanks to God, who has blessed us with a special heritage and story, God is here in this place, and God has given us a new spirit in the midst of this wonderful time together.
So, it is right and fitting that as we begin this celebration, we call out by name those who join us from each college.
With thanksgiving to God, we welcome those from Vale University in Kansas City, Missouri, Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, College of Our Lady of the Elms in Chicopee, Massachusetts, and Fontbonne University in St. Louis, Missouri.
Friends, we rejoice in your presence. We rejoice, for we know that God is here.
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 Oh, faith will always persevere. Faith abides, for God is here.
With thanksgiving to God, we welcome those who join us from Mount St. Mary's University in Los Angeles, California, Regis College in Weston, Massachusetts, St. Joseph's College in Brooklyn and Long Island, New York, the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York, and here at St. Catherine University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Friends, we rejoice in your presence. We rejoice, for we know that God is here.
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 Oh, hope will always persevere. Hope abides, for God is here.
With thanksgiving to God, we welcome the Sisters of St. Joseph, the founders of these educational communities. We welcome our board members, founders and partners, staff members, our alumni, faculty and staff from our CSSJ high schools, and all of you who are here who yearn for justice, all you who seek to meet the needs of the time.
We rejoice in your presence. We rejoice, for we know that God is here. God is here.
God is here.
God is here.
God is here.
Oh, love will always persevere. Love abides, for God is here. Now let us pause and turn our attention to God's wisdom for this day.
The consensus statement of the central ideas of Jean-Pierre Médaille and the Sisters of St. Joseph. Stimulated by the Holy Spirit of love and receptive to inspiration, we move always toward profound love of God and love of neighbor without distinction, for whom we do not separate ourselves, and for whom, in the following of Christ, we work in order to achieve unity of neighbor with neighbor and neighbor with God, directly in this apostolate and indirectly through the works of charity and humility, the spirit of the incarnate word. In sincere charity, the manner of St. Joseph's, whose name we bear. In an Ignatian Salesian climate, that is, with an orientation towards excellence, tempered by gentleness, peace, and joy. This is the wisdom, the word of wisdom.
Be with me, Lord, when I am in trouble. Be with me, Lord, be with me. Be with me, Lord, when I am in trouble. Be with me, Lord, be with me. You who rest in the shadow of the Lord and abide in the presence of God. Say with your heart, my shelter and strength, my God, in you I trust. Be with me, Lord, when I am in trouble. Be with me, Lord, be with me. Be with me, Lord, when I am in trouble. Be with me, Lord, be with me. Call and I will answer, says the Lord. Trust and know I am here. Cling to me with your life. There is nothing you should fear. Be with me, Lord, when I am in trouble. Be with me, Lord, be with me. Be with me, Lord, when I am in trouble. Be with me, Lord, be with me.
This wisdom comes to us from the Gospel of Luke. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read? And he answered, You shall love your Lord God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered right. Do this, and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion, and went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he sat him down on his own beast and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, The one who showed mercy on him. And Jesus said to him, Go and do likewise. The word of wisdom.
A simple word that likely evokes a different example from each of us of what we believe mercy to be. And we would all hope that we, regardless of the belief others may have about us, we would be the Good Samaritan. That we would rise above it all to help someone that is a supposed ideological enemy of ours or labeled as such. As we each could give examples of mercy, we could likely give examples of lack of mercy, of someone else who just doesn't understand me or care about me or agree with me or prioritize my needs above all others. So we label, don't we? For example, faculty in one division get more resources. So we show lack of mercy, perhaps, by finding fault with their decisions or not sending a congratulatory note when they receive a grant or an award. Staff believing faculty get preferential treatment or believing that one group adds more value or is more important than another group. One colleague letting another colleague lie bleeding on the proverbial floor because you don't agree with their approach, never once putting yourselves in their shoes or understanding the situation they are encountering. We create stereotypes of what that other group really stands for. Just like the priest and the Levite distance themselves from the person on the ground. We stereotype faculty, staff, and administration, and sometimes students too. We stereotype each other. We find someone to blame or to criticize or to ignore. While they are not bleeding on the ground as a person was in this parable, they are bleeding from criticism because of our ignorance, not theirs. We are the person who beat them. Perhaps we are the ones who did not understand. Perhaps we are the ones who care more about ourselves than others. Perhaps we are the ones who want to be seen as priestly or holy or worthy of more respect than the person on the ground. Perhaps we are the ones who beat and robbed someone else of their self-esteem and tried to ruin their professional reputation or standing. We create they. They believe this. They act like this. They don't understand. They don't care. Put any noun into they. You each have heard it all. So the Good Samaritan, the real leader in this story, the real change agent, doesn't write an email from the sidelines pointing out the problem. The real Samaritan doesn't go up to the person, analyze the situation, and then write the email asking someone else to do something. The real Samaritan is not a gossip or someone who is a critic behind closed doors. The Samaritan likely faced criticism, perhaps deep criticism from their peers, their neighbors, perhaps other merchants in the association they belonged to. Perhaps they were even ostracized for helping someone perceived as the other. Likely they were asked, how could you help someone like that? The real Samaritan does it anyway. They see the individual, not the stereotype. They stand up. They take responsibility for their words and their actions. They do what they believe to be right and just. They ask questions intended to raise people up, not trap them or make them look bad and themselves look good. They do not hide in the shadows. pointing out other people's faults. They truly play the long game. The kind of mercy they seek leads to wisdom and deepens their compassion. If we have any strength in our claim of having the charism of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet in our individual and collective DNA, it is not only that we see, but we act. We are willing to do the heavy lift to make it better for all. We change, we grow, we transform, we believe, and we do it together.
Receiving the Spirit of God and growing in our faith, we present our needs.
Divine Spirit, hear our prayer. Divine Spirit, hear our prayer.
Spirit of light, let the fire of your wisdom burn brightly within us, our community, and within your holy church, we pray.
Divine Spirit, hear our prayer. Divine Spirit, hear our prayer.
Spirit of silence, in still moments, may we be open to God's presence, transforming our suffering world into a place of love, justice, and peace, we pray.
Divine Spirit, hear our prayer. Divine Spirit, hear our prayer.
Spirit of courage and power, dispel our fears that linger in our hearts, and bestow the gift of your strength upon us, we pray.
Divine Spirit, hear our prayer. Divine Spirit, hear our prayer.
Spirit of peace and joy, help us to be attentive to God's word in our lives, while enthusing us to proclaim aloud the good news, we pray.
Divine Spirit, hear our prayer. Divine Spirit, hear our prayer.
Spirit of love and truth, help us to be inspired by the mission and legacy of the Sisters of St. Joseph, acting for justice, loving unconditionally, and walking humbly with their God, we pray.
Divine Spirit, hear our prayer. Divine Spirit, hear our prayer.
Spirit of life, you have graced us with the mission of the Sisters of St. Joseph. Bless us as they continue to minister in your world. Amen. We invite you to now join us in our unity prayer. Healer of our every ill, breathe in and among all of us who dwell in this land. Soothe our wounds, calm our fears, mend our divisions, hope of all tomorrows.
Open our deaf ears and fill us with compassion. Tender our hearts. Inspire creative ideas to address the cries of our sisters, brothers, and earth itself. Send forth your spirit of love and unity. Transform pointed fingers of blame into hands open in reverence to receive one another. Fan into flame the gift of our founding, and let us be known again as a people united for the goodness, justice, and peace of all people forever. Amen.
Loving God, united in your mission of love and belonging, guide us and send us out to share this love with one another and to be attentive and responsive to the needs of the time. Amen.
Amen.
As we go forth to learn and to lead, may the peace of God bless each of you. At this time, please use the chat window to share with one another a sign of Christ's peace. Thanks be to God.
Dios nos bendiga todos los días de nuestras vidas, de nuestras vidas. Dios nos bendiga todos los días de nuestras vidas, de nuestras vidas.
Good morning. My name is Marcia White, and I am president of the College of St. Rose. I am pleased to introduce to you today our opening speaker, Sister Joan Lescinski, CSJ, PhD. I'm incredibly proud to be the interim president of the College of St. Rose, and though I've led organizations before through difficult times, this is my first rodeo as a college president. Serving as a trustee at St. Rose for more than 20 years, one of my greatest blessings has been to have the opportunity to not only learn from a master, but to build a friendship that I cherish with Sister Joan. Sister Joan Lescinski has left an incredible legacy at every college she's touched. From her 19 years as a professor of English at the College of St. Rose, where she earned her bachelor's and master's degree in English literature, then PhD from Brown University. She served as vice president of academic affairs and dean of Fontbonne University, associate dean of academic affairs at Vale University. But God had other plans and spoke through some very wise leaders who called her into service as president. She led St. Mary's of the Woods College from 1998 to 2007, moving the college to enrollment records, new academic programs, robust strategic and master plans, and a capital campaign that far exceeded its goals. She then arrived at St. Ambrose University in Iowa in 2007, becoming its first sister president and first female president, serving for 13 years. Again, she added new programs, spearheaded new facilities, and launched new partnerships that met the needs of the times. Since 2007, the endowment at St. Ambrose grew from $40 million to $170 million. Apparently, Sister Joan never gets tired. Sister Joan serves on the boards of the College of St. Rose, Mount St. Mary's University, and is a trustee for the Higher Learning Commission and the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities. She also acted as a guide to students from ACSSJ schools on the 2018 Le Puy student pilgrimage, and will be a guide at our next student pilgrimage in 2022. Sister Joan is an example of a sister of St. Joseph and a president in higher education who is definitely meeting the needs of the times. We know that St. Ambrose must have been heartbroken when Sister Joan announced plans to retire this year. But she can always be counted on to share words of wisdom and context, especially in the toughest of times, because she is an expert leader and she is always there to find the future. Today, she will share, has a great deal to share with us, and will do so. We are very grateful to have Sister. There'll be time for question and answers following her presentation. And Sister Rose, I couldn't be happier. Sister Joan, I couldn't be happier.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say thank you to you, Marcia, for your gracious introduction. It's a privilege for me to serve on your board of trustees at St. Rose. And thank you to Martha for inviting me to be part of this ACSSJ conference. I feel privileged to be here. We all know, of course, that these past 16 months have been like no other in anyone's experience, not only for our colleges and universities, but in our personal lives, the lives of our families and our circle of friends. All of them have been impacted, some of them tragically. I don't know how many of you have lost dear ones to COVID, as we certainly have in the Sisters of St. Joseph, but I venture to say that many here have. As I write these words in early May, we do have now signs of hope, that we are moving through the great darkness of what COVID brought us into light, slowly, little by little, and by no means fully. We take steps toward recovering what we say in the church is our ordinary time, returning to a normalcy that may never fully look like the way we remember it. And through it all, we have remained committed to our ministry of higher education. We all carried on. We did not stop. And as I was reflecting in preparation for this gathering, some pieces of our CSSJ history came into my prayer. Let me share a few of those with you. Our first sisters, as we all know, came together in 1650 in France. It was, as the historians among us note, a time of political unrest, of great poverty and disease, and many unmet needs in society, and great uncertainty. It certainly was not a promising time to begin a religious congregation, especially one of apostolic women, when the church at that time preferred that women religious remain in a cloistered life. But the Spirit called those women from various parts of Southwest France, and the Spirit moved Jean-Pierre Médaille as he encountered them on his preaching ministry. And something remarkable, something grace-filled happened. Our little design was born. What a modest way to describe us, our little design. The sisters heard a call, and then, asked later by the city of Le Puy, they moved into an orphanage and met those needs, and more needs, dividing the city, and doing, as the early documents say, all of which woman is capable. Now we can fast forward to today. No one listening to me today is here by accident. We might have applied for a position or fallen into a task needing to be done, taken a position because it was there, dreamed of working at a particular institution where we find ourselves. Whatever our presumed reasons, we are not here by accident. We are meant to be here, called to be here. And so we meet the needs of our colleges and universities by providing all kinds of services, teaching, interacting with colleagues, planning, dreaming, looking out for students who might otherwise fall through the cracks or who have special needs, dividing what is the little city of our own institutions. Our first sisters, we know, came from several parts of the Diocese of Le Puy. They did not know one another, and their ages spanned 30 years. But they created a community just as we have always done, with one another, with our students, with the college and university community. We continue to weave the little design just as our first sisters wove lace. What motivates us? I think it's exactly what motivated the first 6 sisters. God's call to serve, to be with the dear neighbor, to love fully and generously. It's that simple, I think. It may not be easy, of course, but it really is that simple. God's call to us. We see our individual and collective call is to help bring, as we say, neighbor with neighbor, neighbor with God, as the consensus statement reminds us. All those who comprise our colleges and universities are our dear neighbors, and we are committed to them. In these times of unrest, we have made the well-being of the dear neighbor our first priority. We've been asked to meet needs during this pandemic time for which we were all largely unprepared, for which we had little experience, and for which we definitely had no playbook to guide us. And we've done so daily, monthly, searching for the more, the next challenge, and always for the good of the dear neighbor. Every time is the time we have been given. This past year offered significant challenges which all of us here could enumerate. But let me just mention a few. A key challenge for all of us has been the uncertainty, the anxiety, and the fear which has been with us as the pandemic spread. We were, and are now, the calming agents, needing to mask our faces as well as our own fears and anxieties as we reassured our students. We said to them things like this: follow the precautions, and we will do everything we can to keep you safe. Safeguard your own safety and that of everyone else on campus or in your tiny circle at home, and we will be here for you. Do your best, and we will do our best. That's what we told them in so many different ways. And we counted on the grace of God and our legacy of serving the dear neighbor to see us through. And by and large, I think we can all say it has. And in these times, our students, who after all come to college in order to explore their independence, have looked to us for reassurance.
It's nice to be at a conference doing other things.
I know.
It's like so good. Me too.
They look to us for reassurance and we have offered it, even when we ourselves were anxious and fearful. Like the first sisters, we went where we were needed, offering calm, presence, and sometimes tough love. Those sisters in Dupuis would have known exactly what we were doing and why, and they would have been proud of us. Another challenge we have met is the uncertainty of time. As we all know, as academics, we live by predictable schedules, semesters, breaks, holidays, academic years. That's how we arrange our lives. That's what I've done for 50 some years. And COVID upended all of that. Not caring that graduation has always been at a certain time. Not caring whether a course could be taught in a drastically reduced schedule. Not caring about any of those things. And here we are, weary for sure, but here. We made it work. And I might add, I think we'd all agree, along the way, we developed some new skills. This is a good example. New ways of interacting, new ways of forming community. This pandemic has been a dreadful, tragic interruption to our normal lives, but we have received unexpected gifts. A third challenge has been the temptation to focus only on the now, at the risk of losing sight of a bigger picture. The city, the one we divided, is not the world. As educators, we know that the world must become our city. This is the message we must always deliver, even now, when it is tempting to focus on our own little plot of land. This is, after all, the goal of education, leading out, as the root word tells us. A final challenge, although each of you could add many others, has been the temptation to let go of the very reflection, meditation, quiet time, and prayer, which called us to this ministry in the first place. We all know the old saying, the urgent is the enemy of the important. And these months have been incredibly filled with the urgent, haven't they? I do not for a moment reject the urgent. It has consumed my time as it has consumed yours. But unless we continue to make space in our lives, we will not have the inner strength to continue to address the urgent and plan for the bigger picture. Quiet time, contemplative time, retreat time. These inner spaces refuel and renew us. They are critical to our well-being so that we can help the well-being of others. You all know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but it bears saying again. As I said, I know you could add your own challenges, but these might serve as starters for our discussions these days. How do we minister and lead in a time of pandemic? We do our best. We all know that colleges and universities like ours could be on an endangered list, but we will do our best. Interestingly, for me at least, we know little about the ministerial successes or failures of our first sisters. They did their bests. And somehow, God provided what still might have been needed to meet the needs of their city and their time. We do know that the first two foundations in 1836 here in the United States, one thrived, Cahokia, or Carondelet, and one did not, Cahokia. But we remember and we honor both. realizing that both are part of our story. And perhaps that's a good example of what all of us experience. Those efforts we make in ministry that seem to go beautifully and fruitfully, and those where we cannot see the fruit of our labor, wonder if we've gone off in the wrong direction. So let me conclude. We gather virtually at this conference to remember why and by whom we were called, to affirm that call to divide the part of the city where we find ourselves in ministry, to take time for prayer and reflection, and to realize that we have a rich and precious legacy that we share. We know that some legacies are measured in dollars. Ours is priceless. It is a privilege for me today to help us celebrate it together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sister Joan, and welcome everyone. My name is Sharon Rad. I'm an associate professor in organizational leadership here at St. Kate's, and we're so grateful that you're joining us today, Sister Joan, and sharing your wisdom and really inspiring thoughts as we think about the times that we're in right now. I want to invite people to bring your questions and comments into the chat, and we'll be moderating those. And I'm going to kick things off with a question for you, Sister Joan. And as I said, I'm a leadership professor, and we really think that leadership development is about self-development. And I appreciated so much, both in reading your bio as well as your presentation, the long list of accomplishments that you have in your career, combined with an extraordinary humility that you bring, and the way that you look to history to guide us as we look at the times that we're in. I'm wondering if you're willing to share a more personal story about what you found to be really challenging in this last year and how you've used these lessons from history to guide you in your decision making.
Certainly. Again, my responses, I think, are going to be echoed out there by many of the people listening to this. Some of the hard parts, I think, were letting go of those things we treasure so much. And most of it had to do with our being together in our university community. I had to, the toughest decision, I could say this, that I had to make in all these months was, I can remember the date exactly, it was April 2nd. And I said, I'm going to have to cancel spring graduation. We all know what graduation means to our students, what it meant to all of us in our careers. It was an affirmation of success and really bringing together of not just our own efforts, but the support of so many people. And we see that at our commencements with our students every year. And I've been to, I think I counted them up, 76 graduations in my lifetime. And I only remember one really good commencement speech. So that's just something to remember for me. But one of the things that was so hard is it took away not only that affirmation of each of our wonderful students, but the affirmation of those little communities around each student which supported them. And I don't know about your institutions, but mine here has a lot of first-generation students, even as I was a first-generation student myself. And what it meant to my family when I graduated from college, I will never forget. Both my parents were children of immigrants, and none of them had any opportunity to go to college. So their dream was all their children would do so, and we did. But canceling that really just cut me to the chase because I knew the cost it was to our students. We had to cancel the December one as well. And boy, I tell you, when we did that one, I say, whatever it takes, we're going to have a spring 2021 graduation. And we did. And like many of you, it took a very interesting form. It wasn't virtual, it was in person, but a really interesting in person with all the social distancing and masking that was required. But it was those sorts of losses, Sharon, that really cost me. I think you heard me reference in my speech that we had to be calming presence and all that sort of stuff. And we sometimes had to bring tough love. I remember meeting with the student leaders last summer virtually saying, okay, we're bringing everybody back because we could in Iowa to campus, but it's going to be a whole new experience. All the buildings will be locked down. The campus will be locked down, and it will be very strict. And that's not what college kids come for, a strict experience. But if they wanted to come, and they wanted to come, and they told us that in the surveys we sent out, that we would have strict rules, and there would be a chance for a verbal warning if you disobeyed them, a chance for a written warning, and then I would dismiss you from school, by the way, with no refund of your tuition. Mm-hmm. And when we set those rules up, and the student leaders helped us articulate all of those, one of the young men said, now, sister, I know you don't like violent terms, he said, but I'm going to use one because I think you need to know this, that we might have to put a pike on a head or two at the beginning of the year so people know we're serious. I said, well, I'll skip the image, but I know what you're saying to me. And sure enough, within the first 2 weeks of school in August, we had 3 young men flaunt the regulations once, twice, and on the third time, I sent them home. And said to them, you will be welcome in the spring if you can adhere to the rules we have, which are meant only for the health and safety of everybody. Right. Those are 2 of the examples I would use, Sharon. And again, I know everybody in the audience could multiply them again and again, but notice what they all are. They're all about relationships. The one, a great loss through the celebrations that we would have, not only of our students, but all of our faculty and staff who retired last year, and the lovely ceremonies and rituals we have, all of that had to be done virtually. And then having to send students home because they couldn't or wouldn't stand by the safety measures we put in place, a fracturing of a relationship, if you will. Those were the hard things for all of us. What I take great comfort in is I was surrounded by an incredible faculty and staff and cabinet and board of trustees who stood by me as we made those decisions. But those were really tough. I can say some more, but I think that would get the point across.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I appreciate the focus on relationships, and I'm bringing back in the comment that President Roloff made in her opening, and thinking about being a good Samaritan and how we're good Samaritans on campus and our campus communities to one another. You know, our campus sits in St. Paul. I'm over in Minneapolis, and right in the middle between us is where George Floyd was murdered. And so I'm wondering, as you're thinking about, you know, the challenges of these times, and how much our attention, our collective attention, has been drawn to really the horrible instances of racism and violence that have occurred. Where are the lessons surfacing for you in relationship, and particularly thinking, right, about the really robust history of the sisters, and what that brings to us to this time in relationship to race, and how we care for the dear neighbor, and really attend to the scourge of racism?
Sure, be glad to. And then I noticed there's a question from Barbara McCormick. So after I respond to this one, if you
we'll get there,
I'll respond to that one.
Yeah.
We too, as the whole world was, and rightly so, just shocked and almost to the sense of despair at the murder of George Floyd and the others, as their names became household words for all of us. Martyrs, if you will, to this terrible systemic oppression that has been part of our history as a country, not as a, part of our history as a country, the United States of America, since before our founding. And I was touched that the president today started us out with a recollection of the lands on which all of us sit, that are indigenous people. And we're doing the same sort of thing here at St. Ambrose that you're doing at St. Kate's in honoring the indigenous people here, the Blackhawks in our case. But that part was extremely difficult, and it was really very interesting. Shortly thereafter, there was a desire to hold a prayer vigil, if you will, in a park which is contiguous to our campus, and there was real fear that there might be violence there. And so what we did was we invited all of those people who wanted to attend that to come and park their cars at St. Ambrose. And we'd have security people there making sure that they were safe parking their cars there, and if they wanted to be escorted over to the park. And then we talked with our local police, who are very good to us here at St. Ambrose, and pleaded with them to be present, not so much as police, but as Davenport citizens sharing in the prayer service that was going to go on. It was extraordinary to watch what happened. The people came in droves. Again, we made sure they could park in safety and be escorted and over and back. And the police knelt in prayer with the people in the park. Now, that wasn't all because of what we did. Many, many others were calling on people to do that. But I think it inspired many in our community, including local students, because the students from afar, of course, weren't there this summer. But it has carried over as our own diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts really have taken on a whole new meaning on our campus. I think as our hiring practices have changed, as our care of our students from diverse communities has become more a part of who we are. And all of that, I think, has helped us deal with an issue which is not going away, which is a part of us going forward. As we say about all of our efforts, this is just another step. This is just another step. We have a long, long journey to go. So I hope that made some response to your question, Sharon. Is that all right?
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Let me go back to Barbara's question, if I may. Is that all right? Okay.
Yeah.
And then you'll watch these, right? And then
yes, yep. No, we've got a whole group of people watching the questions.
Okay,
yeah.
Good.
So
okay.
Yeah.
So Barbara asks, what measures or steps did you take to ease faculty and staff back to campus, in person on campus? What activities did you do with them? That's a really terrific question. And again, something everybody has faced. As you would imagine, in that second week in March, we sent everybody home, and we furloughed a lot of people. Happily, we were able to bring them all back, and happily the government benefits helped everyone so that no one suffered financially, for which I was deeply, deeply grateful. But everybody was at home, and I used to come every day to my office because I have a little separate entrance and work here and go home for lunch and go back, and never saw anybody, of course, in person. But in April, we knew if we were going to try to open in the fall, we're going to have to bring people back in the fall. And so we surveyed our faculty and staff and said, what do you need to be able to come back and feel safe in the fall? And they wrote very, very, we did some checkoff stuff, but we really wanted the comments to understand where people were coming from. And by and large, what we heard is what all of us have heard, which is we need to know you will have taken the steps that are necessary to make the physical environment safe for us to be in a classroom or in an office, or for our coaches to be working with our student athletes. And all of those things were part of what we gave to a wonderful group we called the implementation team. And we were helped by the fact that we have a master's in public health at St. Ambrose University. So on my faculty, I have 2 epidemiologists. So we had our own Dr. Fauci's, if you will, on campus to help us do those specific sorts of things. For instance, we've put in, as many of you have, the air filters that you use for hospital level filtering all over our campus. We put up all the plexiglass and all of those things that everybody needed, and put the mask requirements, spread out the classrooms so that everybody was socially distanced in a classroom, and did the things that faculty and staff said would make them feel at least reasonably safe and reasonably comfortable to come back to campus. Was everybody happy about coming back? No, and I know that, and urged people to come and express their concerns to me, which we did. And wherever we could, we accommodated those concerns. But we, like all of you, are built on personal relationships with our students. And only some of that can be done virtually. And we know that. And our students wanted, that's what their surveys told us, both the returning students and the incoming students, please bring us back to campus. And we did. And again, we had a few COVID cases during the year with faculty and staff, and a few with students. But when we did our contact tracing, we realized that not a single case could be traced to the university. All of them happened elsewhere. So those are some of the things we did. Are there people who are still afraid and worried? Of course there are. Now, of course, with vaccines, the fear is that you could feel it's palpably less as we all get vaccinated. Probably you're going to ask, are we requiring it? No, we're not requiring it, partly because in the state of Iowa, the governor has issued a proclamation saying you can't require it. But what we're doing is what we've been doing, which is strongly encouraging people to get it, and then using ourselves as examples to say, I and all of the cabinet and all of the deans and all of the, people group after group have been vaccinated. So those are some of the things we did to help people feel safe. Barbara, I hope that responds to your question. So Sharon, I'll turn it back to you to tell me what the questions are next.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of continue on this line, and we have a question around this idea that, many people are anxious to get back to normal, but we know that the last 15, 16 months have actually been so profoundly disruptive to whatever normal was, that it's changed us, and it's changed us as individuals, and it's changed the way we interact with one another, and that perhaps, even as you said in your talk, that what used to be normal may never be again. So as we're thinking about that and what lessons we can learn from this and what we can take away and how we might use this experience really to inform us in creating a better world, what are your thoughts about, what aspects of this experience that we should actually continue? In particular, the question from the audience is, how do we allow those who cannot participate in person to still be involved? So I'd invite you to answer that question and then think more broadly about, what important lessons, shifts did we have to make that we should really hold on to?
I think the fact that all of us are now at least reasonably comfortable doing what we're doing right now, which is meeting virtually, should enable us to meet the needs of people. I'm chuckling because I live in Iowa where there's a lot of snow, not as much snow as in upstate New York, Marcia, but there's a lot of snow. Okay. And what we've said is there won't be any more snow days, because if we can't do classes on campus, every class, and every faculty member knows this, must now have the ability to go virtual at a moment's notice. And the ability, if there is a case of a student who's ill, to be able, or injured or hospitalized or whatever, to be able to continue his or her studies virtually. So I think we're going to have ways that make the loss of instructional time maybe go close to non-existent. And I know there's some hands-on stuff like labs and so on that do have to be done in person. But for the most part, I think we're going to eliminate the fact that you can't get to class because the weather is bad, or even because you're not feeling well. some of the lessons I think that we're going to take forward from here do have to do with, I'll just use the advancement area if I can. I know we've been talking about students and putting all our attention on them, as we should, since that's why we're here, is to serve students. But I remember when, a year ago, March, my vice president for advancement and I said, well, there goes the fundraising world. And yet that's not true. We turned out to raise more money in our annual fund last year and are on par to do it again this year than we've done in any of our years before. And our capital processes didn't get hurt either, because what we discovered was that people, our alums and our donors from around the country, even around the world, now can reach out to us and we to them in ways with ease that we never could before. I've seen face-to-face, or if you will, virtual face-to-virtual-face, more alums and donors in the last 15 months than I've ever done in any given 15-month period in either of my presidencies. And I think part of it was, and maybe will continue to be, people are not traveling as much. And they're still a little anxious about having people travel to them, but they're starved for connection and connection with things they care about. In this case, our own institutions. And so I have been able to reach out, not just in a fundraising way, but one of the things I did early on was call our advancement area and say, tell me how many alums we know are over 65 and living alone. And let me just make some calls and Zooms, that was a ministry I didn't know I had. And it was stunning. And so I guess I would say to the advancement and alumni areas, folks, you've got whole new ways that you can reach out now to the people who care about you. People often say to me, don't you hate asking for money? I said, I never ask for money. I ask for people to join us in supporting a mission we all care about. And that's very different from saying to somebody, take your checkbook out. And it's, I think those are some of the lessons we will carry on. For instance, in our board of trustee meetings, I've had 100% attendance of my board for the last 15 months. And that's never true. And some of it now is hybrid. And the last one we just did in April, a little more than half of the folks were there physically. But I think we will find ways now to have new connections, and back to that word we care about, new relationships, or the buttressing of relationships that we never thought about before.
Mm-hmm. So there's another question that's really fairly related to what you have just said, and I think I think you might have a bit to add to in your response to this question. So the question really is thinking about how, and I don't have a Catholic background, so I might say this improperly, and I invite you to correct my pronunciation. How important was our CSJ Charism? Did I say that? Is that right?
Perfectly. Couldn't say that myself.
I've been hanging around long enough, apparently. How important was the Charism as you helped St. Ambrose increase its endowment so dramatically? Like, in what ways did it, did it inform you and inspire you? And you've talked about some other ways that you helped the endowment increase so dramatically, but anything else you want to add about that?
Well, if I think about the, you also got to say, everybody who's managing an endowment, the market's been very, very nice to us of late. So I have to give some credit to the endowment, or to the market, but mostly to the folks who helped us raise money. One of the ways we increased our endowment was to emphasize endowed scholarships. That's something that's not at all hard to sell. When I'm talking to any donor of any means, I say to them, something else you might want to consider also is endowing a scholarship. And then I just go on to use my own story about the fact that I couldn't have gone to college without a scholarship. And look what that education has opened up for me in my life. But our CSJ Charism, I think that notion of uniting neighbor with neighbor and neighbor with God really is not, what would I say, unique in helping ACSSJ institutions. It's helped both of the institutions where I've served as president One that was founded and is sponsored by the Sisters of Providence, and one which is a diocesan university where I am now. But that notion, and I go back again to the wonderful image of using the Good Samaritan, that reaching out to the dear neighbor. And at St. Ambrose, you know, I've got one here. Where is it? Our mascot is the bee, because St. Ambrose, 4th century bishop of Milan, doctor of the church, he wrote about the bee, and it is said that his eloquence was so great it was like honey coming from his mouth. So of course the bees would all come and, oh, you get the drill, okay? And we use it, of course. We swarm and we have hives, and anything you can think of, we do it with the bee. But the point here is that that notion that the neighbor is the person we want to be in contact with. When I talk about endowed scholarships, it's not a hard sell at all. And we've tripled them, I think, since I've come, because everybody understands the need for students and their families to get help in attending institutions like ourselves. So some of that, I think, has helped me as I've reached out to others to help us build our endowment. Obviously, we're doing unrestricted giving that we all need, but endowed giving and targeted giving, all of those are pieces of how people can join us in this ministry of Catholic higher education.
So I'm going to pick up on something that you just shared. I thought it was powerful, and you kind of passed over it, but it was an important point when you shared that you were the recipient of a scholarship and that you couldn't have gone to college without that. And you know, as you said, look where you've ended up, right? And you're at your point of retirement. At this point, I'm guessing that you are not done with your life's work, right? Perhaps paid employment.
Certainly pray to God not. Yeah.
And I want to link this idea of, you know, a good deed or an act of generosity that gives someone else an opportunity, and we never know where that would go, and that's your story. And I want to link that with this idea that you made, and this is from the audience as well, the point about the Cahokia and Carondelet, and this idea of honoring both success and failure. And this person from the audience shared, you know, that it's prompting them to reflect on what are some of their Cahokia moments and some of their Carondelet moments.
Yeah.
But as you think about that, what are the successes that you're most proud of? And the failures perhaps that you've been most informed by and grown from in your career, and as you're at this really important change point in your own life and your career?
Sure. In terms of change point, yeah, I'll stay here for a year. The board has asked me to remain in residence to assist my successor, who's wonderful. She's a perfect fit for us. And I'm thrilled that she and her husband and 8 kids are coming to be the next president of St. Ambrose. Here's a little thing I'd like to put in a parenthesis, though. I think it's important because many of us come out of a history of being a women's college and may still be a women's college today. When I was hired as the 13th president of St. Ambrose in 2007, I was the first woman to be president. And that was a really big deal. And as you would imagine, that was everywhere and blah, 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 blah. And I remember after I got here that one of the first groups I talked to was a group of professional women in the greater Quad Cities. And they asked me all kinds of things. And somebody asked me about being the first woman president of St. Ambrose and blah, blah. And I smiled and I said, here's the thing I have to say to you. I get it. It's a historic moment. We broke a glass ceiling. That's great. But I look forward to the day when we stop using woman as an adjective and just say, she's our next president. And when our next president, our 14th president, so our president-elect, Dr. Amy Novak, was hired, our PR people said to me, oh, we could say, this is the second woman. I said, gone. I said, that ceiling was broken. We don't have to do that anymore. We say our next 14th president will be Dr. Amy Novak. She and her husband and her 8 children will come. I said, that's how we talk about it. And so I say that simply because I often think about that when President Obama was elected and we talked about our first African-American president. Won't it be wonderful when all of those words, not because we don't treasure the heritage that women bring, or that our African American or our indigenous people bring. Not anything like that. Treasuring actually them, cultivating them. You know, we now have our students from a particular cultural backgrounds wear certain stoles at commencement to honor those things. You probably do the same thing. But the point here being that those ceilings, we want them to break so that we stop using those kinds of words. I don't say, for instance, that I have a woman doctor. I have a doctor who happens to be a woman, you know, but I don't even say that anymore. I just say, I love my doctor. She's terrific. Okay. So I don't know why I got off on that. You want me to talk about successes and failures. Let me talk about successes here. I mean, you've heard a bunch of them already. So we've raised a lot of money. We built a lot of buildings. Okay, all that stuff. We also put in superb new academic programs that, like our church, meeting the needs of the times, like our religious community, looking out, dividing the city and seeing what needs to be done. For instance, at St. Ambrose, a number of years ago, we put in a wonderful physician assistant graduate program because we're a rural state. And many of our small towns, people might have to drive 60 and 70 miles to get to a doctor. And many of our students coming to be physician assistants look forward to going back to their communities and being the on-site healthcare provider. So those are some of the things I'm very, very proud of. So enough of that. Did we have failure? Sure, we did. Here's one. Try this one on for size. We bought some property. Our diocese, when I was coming, had to declare bankruptcy because of suits in relation to sexual abuse scandals. So that was all on the table when I was coming. So the diocese had to sell all its property and turn it over to the bankruptcy court. That included 44 acres, 3 blocks away from us. Well, think about what we'd love to do with 44 acres, 3 blocks away from us. And in fact, the board said to me, as part of the marching orders they gave me when I came, you figure out how to buy that property and develop the athletic fields that we've never had. I mean, I send all my people off to high schools to use their athletic facilities. We just didn't have any. So we did indeed, took a couple of years, but we bought it. And then we wanted to develop it. And the people living right around it made a great stink and said, no, we don't want this to happen. And the mayor of our town, who is a St. Ambrose University alum, we brought our case to the zoning board and they passed it. We brought our case to the city council and they passed it. The mayor vetoed it. And we could not go forward because to override a veto took an almost unanimous vote, which we knew we couldn't get. So there we sat. And for about 48 hours, well, I won't tell you my state of mind, but you can imagine it. And then I said, all right, already, we're going to find a way to deal with this failure. And it was a failure. Okay. And next to that property is a Catholic high school. So I went to them and I said, guess what? Although the city can prevent hospitals and colleges from developing as they wish, state law in Iowa lets high school properties be developed in any way the high school wants. How'd you like to partner with us? And so we sold the property to them. We worked with them. We now have the facilities that we have long needed. But it was one of those long efforts, and it looked like in the end it was a colossal failure. I still have deep regret that we could not do it in a manner that made sense to all of us. But as you know, you live, you learn, you move on. And are there some interactions with various people over the years? Sure. Some people I have had to let go for a variety of reasons. Those are, I don't consider them failures, but I surely consider them in many ways the fracturing of relationships that I treasured. So those are some of the things, and I could duplicate that in almost any of the 5 institutions that I've had the privilege of serving in, 3 of our own, as you heard, St. Rose, Avila, and Fonfon. And now happy to serve on the board at Mount St. Mary. So all of you could multiply those, and I've got them as well.
Right. The story you told about partnering with the high school reminds me of a similar story about the building of one of our buildings on campus at St. Kate's, and the ingenuity and creativity of the sisters in order to move things forward. So I really appreciate your creative thinking there. We just have a couple minutes left, and I just want to invite you. You've brought up the theme of relationships, and as we know, learning is relational and leadership is relational. And I just want to offer you an opportunity for a minute or two to anything you want to share as you're closing out here, keys to relationships and leadership.
I think if you were to say to me, and those who know me from my youth, and there are some people on this call who knew me from the day I entered actually, some of them taught me before I entered. One of the people we lost, our sisters lost, was my 7th and 8th grade teacher. One of our sisters we lost from COVID. So kind of dear to my heart, sadness again. So many of you share things like that. If those who knew me from my youth knew me as I still am, which is, if you put the labels out, a type A, hard driving, get the work done, blah, blah person. Right. Okay. But what I've learned, and it may be the hardest lesson of my life, is that it's far more important to listen than to speak. Now, for a woman whose stock in trade is language, as mine is, spoken and written, to say that is so counterintuitive to who I am.
Yeah.
And yet that's the lesson I've learned. And in those relationship agonies that we all go through before, currently, and in our future, the lesson I've learned is listen first, Joan. Listen first. Not only when there is a challenge of a relationship that appears to be on the rocks or whatever it might be, but more importantly, as a leader. Okay, I'm president of a university. I'm supposed to be the person who stands up at the end and says, folks, here's what we're going to do. And you hope to God it's the right response, right? But what I've learned is when I would first be a leader, I would sit down at the table and I'd say, okay, folks, we got this issue and this is what I think we should do. Bad move, Joan, because all the creative insight of everyone else just goes by the by. There's a person on this thing today who is one of the people who modeled this new behavior, listen first. And that's Marie Joan Harris from the St. Louis province of Carondelet, who was a mentor to me in so many ways when she was vice president of academic affairs at Vale University, and I was her associate dean. To watch her assemble a group of people around her and say, here's the issue, what do you think? And then to watch her listen and bring together all that wisdom and come up with a solution that could carry forward with everybody taking part in it, it just stunned me. I just never seen it before like that. And it taught me that lesson. But if I learned nothing else as a leader, and the advice I'd pass on to any leader is listen more than you talk, and use that plural pronoun, we, so much more than the singular one, I. As I've said to people who've said to me, what's your proudest accomplishment? I always say, here's what I think we did well. Because as I mentor a lot of new presidents, as you would imagine, and I say to them, it's tempting to use I, but nothing you ever accomplish did you do alone. So always say we, except when there's blame to be had, and then stand up and say I. Don't throw your people under the bus, stand up and say I. So those are some of the things I think, Sharon, that I would share. And I know on this call are many people from whom I have learned so many of these things. And my hope is that in whatever volunteer ministries I'll be involved in as I go forward, God granting me good health to do so, I will hope to continue learning because that's the one thing I think we know. We're not done. till we're done. And God isn't finished with us till God is finished with us. And then it's a glorious onward forever in the learning of the great beyond.
That's so wonderful. Thank you, Sister Joan. We'll take away those lessons to listen more than we talk and to really use I. There are many messages in the chat thanking you for your thoughts today, and grateful for your leadership and your friendship and your mentorship and the way that you've inspired everyone today. So I'm going to ask that someone can save that for you so that you'll have that later.
Thank you so much.
I want to thank everyone else for joining us this morning. Our next session begins in just a few minutes, I think actually about a half an hour at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. noon Central, and 10 a.m. Pacific. You can feel free to stay connected. If you do so, just mute your microphone, and you can mute your camera if you like, but do take a break and be back here at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 Central, 10 a.m. Pacific for the next speaker, who will begin at that time, again on this same link. Thanks, everyone.
Good afternoon. I'm Sister Carol Jean Vale, president of Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia. It is an honor to be with you today to introduce a Chestnut Hill College alumna, Tia Noelle Pratt, class of 1999. Time passes quickly. I remember Tia as an enthusiastic, inquisitive, friendly student in our College for Women. It is a special moment to have the privilege to introduce a successful graduate, one in whom great potential was always evident. Those of you who have attended or ministered at a women's college know there is a special bond created over those 4 years, student with student and student with faculty, staff, and administrators. I'm not saying it is better than those ties characteristic of coeducational institutions. It is just different. And I recall those 11 years of my presidency before we transitioned to coeducation with great fondness and pride in the women who attended Chestnut Hill College. In just a few minutes, Tia will speak on The Call is Coming from Inside the House, Anti-Racism and Charism of the Sisters of St. Joseph. I have no doubt that her words will challenge and encourage us to improve as we work to create college environments that are enriched by inclusion, equality, and equity, colleges that are anti-racist. Tia Noelle Pratt, PhD, is a sociologist specializing in the study of systemic racism in the Catholic Church and the ways in which that racism impacts African-American Catholic identity. Dr. Pratt received her PhD in sociology from Fordham University and is the director of the Mission, Engagement, and Strategic Initiatives at Villanova University and the president and director of research at T.N. Pratt and Associates, LLC, an inclusion and diversity consulting firm. Dr. Pratt is also the curator of the hashtag Black Catholic Syllabus. More information, including references to her scholarship and the hashtag Black Catholic Syllabus, can be found on Dr. Pratt's website, www.tiaaprat.com. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Tia Noelle Pratt. Tia.
Thank you, Sister Carol Jean. It is a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much for inviting me. And now let's see if I can share my screen and start the presentation. Let's see. All right, there we go. So as Sister Carol Jean said, and thank you again, Sister Carol, for that wonderful introduction. The title of my talk today is The Call is Coming from Inside the House, Anti-Racism and the ACSSJ Charism. And I want to start by giving just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about my approach to this work, about systemic racism and anti-racism, a bit about my specific research in this area, and I'll conclude with some remarks about the Black Catholics syllabus, which was launched almost a year ago on June 10th last year. So here we go. So some of you may recognize this very kind face as belonging to Father Brian Massengale. And Father Massengale is a theology professor at Fordham University. And in 2017, Father Massengale gave the keynote address at the Ignatian Family Teach-In, where he talked about how when we have these conversations about race, these what he called honest adult conversations about race, people may feel uncomfortable. And as he put it, this work ain't going to be easy. And I appreciated what he had to say that day, because it is very much the approach that I take as I do this work. We have to be ready to be uncomfortable. We have to be ready to make others uncomfortable. And it's important that we allow ourselves to be in that space of discomfort and creating discomfort, because that's the only way that this work of understanding systemic racism, of doing the work of anti-racism is going to get done. And an approach that I use and have used for a long time comes from the work of sociologist Joe Fegan. And Professor Fegan talks about racism as being foundational and systemic. You know, there is so much discourse, vitriolic discourse in our society right now about systemic racism not being real. And one of the things that I have spent truly my entire adult life working on is about systemic racism and the way that it lives in our institutions and impacts how all of us live our lives in institutions. I'm a sociologist, and that's really the key element of being a sociologist, is understanding how we live our lives in institutions. And so Professor Fegan talks about how systemic racism pervades all of society's core institutions: the economy, education, politics, religion, the family. I mean, just think about how, just now, in earlier this year in 2021, we've had our first Asian American and our first African American vice president. We're not too far removed from our first African American president. The fact that so far into this, we're still talking about those kinds of firsts tells us just how deeply these things are embedded into our society. And Professor Fegan goes on to talk about systemic racism as being oppressive and exploitative, that it is designed to exploit land and labor for the material and social benefit of those who created society's core institutions and the hierarchies that lie therein. And in my approach to this work, one of the things that I talk about repeatedly is how it is not enough to not be someone who engages in the mano a mano or personal racism. And that's the racism of, racist graffiti and using racial slurs and burning crosses on people's lawns. I mean, that it's not enough to not be that person. We must also think about the ways our systems are designed to oppress some while benefiting others. And this is really a key principle of critical race theory, which we've been hearing a lot about, much of it misinformation, but we've been hearing a lot about in the last few months. And one of those key principles is that these seemingly benign race neutral policies that have the effect of maintaining and perpetuating white supremacy regardless of the policy's intent. And that point right there, as I used to say in class quite often, at that point, I want us to take that thought and hold it. because we're coming back to it. And students used to love when I say, take that thought and hold it, because we're coming back to that. But before we can come back to that, we need to, what I like to say, be on the same page about race relations, racial justice, and anti-racism, and what these things even mean. And especially when I use these terms in my work and in talks such as this, and in my writing, what we're getting at. The model of race relations is the model of personal racism. That's the model that only sees racism as something that happens between individuals. That is the racism of a few bad apples or a few bad actors, and doesn't take into consideration the way that racism impacts our social structures. And from there, we have moved into a model of racial justice, which looks at these issues from an institutional and systemic point of view, but doesn't really do anything about them. And the conversation has moved in some circles, and needs to move more broadly to a place of anti-racism. That's the conversation that, as church and in higher ed and in Catholic higher ed and in our society more broadly, we need to have that conversation and talk about the ways in which anti-racism works to dismantle these systemically racist systems and rebuild them in ways that are just and equitable. And anti-racism has three phases. The calling out of the racism, the making people uncomfortable. The second phase being white folks realizing either that they're racist or not as progressive as they thought they were, or at the very least that the systems are racist and designed to work in their favor. And part of this second step is the realization that white supremacy is much more than the Klan, the Proud Boys, and other armed violent organizations. Those organizations, those violent paramilitary organizations, are designed to invoke fear, to terrorize, and by doing so, making those that are marginalized, particularly African Americans, too frightened to pursue their rights, pursue justice, pursue systems that will work for everyone and not just a few. So it is this armed paramilitary wing of white supremacy that makes all of the other realms of white supremacy possible. And that is something that we don't talk enough about in society. And the third phase of anti-racism, as I've framed it in my work, is doing the work of dismantling racist systems in order to build systems that are anti-racist. And I have the work here in capital letters, for a very specific reason, because we have to think about the work as just that, something that happens in capital letters, something that is just that important. And well, I'm only here to do parts 1 and 3. And I always like to give a shout out to my wonderful former student who made this for me, this gift for me, as I told her, I'm here to break down systemic racism, like Wonder Woman smashing the glass. And in 20 minutes, she sent this to me. So I'm very grateful to her for that. But as I said, I only do parts 1 and 3 because in reality, part 2 that I outlined a moment ago, that's the part white folks need to do amongst themselves. And that part is essential, but I can't do that part because as people of color say, we didn't make these systems. And because we didn't make these systems, it is up to those that make them and benefit from them and perpetuate them to really do that part of the work. So, over the last year and a half, we've seen a lot. a global pandemic that still isn't over, that has killed almost 600,000 people in this country alone. We've seen the murder of George Floyd and all that resonated with in society, all that resulted in. But it wasn't just the murder of George Floyd. It was Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Trayvon Martin and Emmett Till and so many others in between and since that have brought us to this global reckoning that started nearly a year ago and that we are still in. And the church is not immune to that. It's not immune to that at all. And we have to realize that the call is coming from inside the house, that it's not, these things aren't something that happens far away. It's not something that happens on somebody else's campus or somebody else's congregation. It is happening where we all are right now, and we have to deal with it. We cannot this will not wait any longer. And so as we move forward, I want to talk with you about some of the ways the systemic racism in the church factors into my own work. And in order to do that, we need to start with the numbers. The Census Bureau, the most recent data from the Census Bureau tells us that there are 43.9 million Blacks in the US, those that identify as only one race, because we know that since 2000, we can check as many boxes as we like in the race question on the census. But when we're just looking at those that check only one box, we get 43.9 million Blacks in the US, or 13.4% of the US population. Well, since the census doesn't ask about religion, we need to go to other sources for that. So CARA, the Center for the Applied Research in the Apostolate at Georgetown University, tells us that there are 72.4 million self-identified Catholics in the US, or 22.1% of the US population. Now, that is those who are self-identified as Catholic. Those are the folks that check a box, not necessarily folks that are active participants in Mass or the sacraments or any of those things, those that are just going to check a box when asked. Well, very recently, back in February, Pew Research Center released a really groundbreaking study on Black Americans called Faith Among Black Americans. And I was very glad to be a consultant on this project for a little over 3 years. And as a result of this project, one of the things that we have learned is that 6% of Blacks in the US are Catholic. Now, that number includes those who just check one box on the census, but also those that identify as Afro-Latino or identify as Black or African American, along with some other racial designation. So, but if we're just using the number that I gave earlier from the Census Bureau, 6% of that would give us 2.6 million Black Catholics in the US. The USCCB tells us that there are 3 million Black Catholics in the US. And given that the Pew numbers include Afro-Latinos or those who are of mixed race, including Black or African American, then that 3 million makes a little more sense. But what that tells us is that approximately 0.75%, between 0.75% and 1% of the US population are Black Catholics, and a little over 3.5% of Catholics in the US are Black. Well, those numbers, frankly, they just don't add up. Given the number of Blacks, the number of Catholics, the number of Black Catholics is disproportionately small. Yet, we're still talking about millions of people, whether we're talking about 2.6 million, 3 million, or even more. We're still talking about millions of people. The people isn't nobody. And that still means, even with that lowest number that I just gave you of 2.6 million, there's still more Black Catholics in the US than there are Black Episcopalians or members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the core Black Protestant denominations. So, why don't these numbers add up? Well, the short answer is racism, but we'll get deeper into that as we go on. But a key part of that conversation is about the perception of this fundamental incompatibility between being Black and Catholic. And one of the things that I have argued in my work since I was an undergraduate, and I started doing this work as an undergraduate at Chestnut Hill College, that fundamental incompatibility does not exist for Black Catholics. Being both Black and Catholic cannot possibly be incompatible for those who are, in fact, Black and Catholic. Those who claim both of these identities figure out a way to make it work. But this brings us to, the racism part of why that number is so small. And we have here the wonderful Nobel laureate and Roman Catholic, which I don't think is as well known as it should be, Toni Morrison. And Toni Morrison once said in an interview, if you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And we need to confront the ways our church has put Black people on their knees. And we can look at this in terms of the history of Black Catholics in the United States and the ways that systemic racism has impacted that collective experience and the way systemic racism is still impacting that collective experience. The most extreme form of systemic racism, slavery. And it is essential that we think about this in terms of what the church was in the United States, and remember that it wasn't always this massive institution that we understand it and know it to be today, that it wasn't always this massive institution that was a major provider of social services and healthcare and education from pre-K through PhD. And, from first grade to PhD, I am a product of Catholic education in this country. So I can tell you just from that about how massive an experience, massive the institution is just in that realm of education. So, but before all of that really took shape, the Catholic was deemed a mission church by the Vatican in the US. And it was a fledgling institution struggling to fit in with its Protestant neighbors. And in those efforts to fit in, acquiesced to and perpetuated racist norms as they established footholds in the United States. My colleague at Villanova, Dr. Shannon D. Williams, in her work talks about the church being the largest corporate slaveholder in the Americas. And that is something that we don't talk enough about as church, and the ramifications of that as we continue to move forward and continue to deal with and reckon with these issues of systemic racism. And beyond that, denying Black men and women access to the priesthood and religious life, and even in the 20th century, in the mid 20th century, when that access started to become officially allowed in wider circles and spaces, that it was still so difficult that we didn't have the access, and we didn't have the numbers that we should have, and that still resonates today. Just where I grew up and where I currently live in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, Black men were not allowed to attend the seminary until the middle of the 20th century, and still did not graduate its first Black seminarian until 1974, who is still in active ministry today. So that just tells you that none of this was that long ago. Another key element, denying Black Catholics access to the basics of Catholic life, like the sacraments and parish life. I mean, we still have people Black Catholics who are alive today who will tell you about not being able to receive their first communion along with all of the other communicants, that they had to wait out over on the side before until all of the white children had received communion. I mean, those things, they stay with you. You know, when that happens at 8 and you're still telling that story at 88 like it happened last Sunday, that shows just how deeply these things resonate and the way that collective trauma impacts collectively how Catholicism is experienced. And yet we still have greater numbers of Black Catholics in the United States than we do Black Episcopalians or members of the AME Church. So as I started to allude to a minute ago, you know, the consequences of this are still being felt. They're being felt in the minuscule numbers of African Americans in the priesthood and religious life. That's being felt in congregational leadership. It's being felt in our colleges and universities, our parishes, our schools, our chancery offices. I mean, chancery offices in particular. I mean, let's think about that for a minute. I mean, why is it that Black leadership in our chancery offices begins and ends in the office of Black Catholics in the few dioceses that still have offices of Black Catholics? Because there are many that don't anymore. So I know that's been a lot in just a few minutes. So, you know, let's take a pause and really think about, as we transition into the next part of our conversation today, in what ways do we need to break down the structures of systemic racism in our Catholic institutions, and especially in our Catholic higher ed institutions. And so that brings us to this section of the conversation where I'm talking about my own work. And so I am working on a book that right now is called Faithful and Devoted: Racism and Identity in the African American Catholic Experience. And I'm using mixed qualitative methodology to push back against this lingering idea that being Black and Catholic are not compatible, as I talked about a moment ago, or that there are no Black Catholics. You'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be, about how often I hear that, oh, I didn't know there were Black Catholics, or that what few Black Catholics there are in the United States only trace their origins to conversions that took place after World War II. And that's just not true. And another piece that I take on in this work is, you know, pushing back against what I call the exoticism of Black Catholics. And that happens when scholars of Catholicism, white scholars of Catholicism in particular, talk about something that is perfectly wonderful and beautiful because it is ordinary, and give it the air of the extraordinary or the exotic because it's Black Catholics who are doing it. When in reality, you know, there have been Black Catholics globally as long as there have been Catholics. There have been Black Catholics in the United States since before there was a United States. So, you know, this exoticism is something that happens because just because something is new to white scholars doesn't mean that it's new. And that's something that my work pushes back on and needs to push back on in terms of how we see whiteness and the way whiteness is centered in Catholicism. So another point that I make is that systemic racism in the church is as another reason why we have such a small number of African American Catholics, and that racism continues to impact Black Catholics' experience through things like church closings, parish reorganizations, school closings. You know, here in Philadelphia, we're losing 2 of our diocesan high schools at the end of the school year. I mean, that is a very painful and difficult process. And, you know, the core piece of what I do is really talking about Black Catholic identity as an act of resistance to that systemic racism. That resistance comes from bringing one's Blackness, one's whole self, as Sister Thea Bowman talked about, into the life of the church. And, you know, a minute ago, I talked about that core principle of critical race theory. And I said, you know, hold that thought because we're coming back to it. And here we are, you know, in our colleges and universities. I mean, let's think about it for a minute. if the canonical sponsoring congregation of an institution maintains leadership of the institution, but the congregation is all white, then by definition, there will be all white leadership. So, that is one of the ways, just one of the ways that even in Catholic higher ed, we can see that core principle of critical race theory manifesting itself when seemingly benign race neutral policies actually perpetuates white supremacy. And in drawing again on the work of Professor Fegan, how it's built into the fabric of the institution. I have a line in my book where I say, systemic racism is woven into the fabric of our society the way strands of hair are woven into a thick braid. I mean, it's just that intricate and that intimately connected to how our society is structured. And so in the book, I focus a lot on issues of race, space, and place. And one of the things I talk about is parish life and the two key ways that Black parishes have come into being in the United States. Parishes that were specifically created as such as St. Peter Claver in Philadelphia, or those that developed through neighborhood changes and the collapse of the national parish model. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes talking with you about St. Peter Claver. And this is the southwest corner of 12th and Lombard in Philadelphia, also known as the location of St. Peter Claver. And St. Peter Claver has not been an active church for a long time, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And you might notice that it does not look like what you might think a Catholic church, especially one in the Northeast, would look like. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So the story of St. Peter Claver officially begins in 1886, when Black Catholics in Philadelphia came together under the name of Peter Claver Union. And they came together to worship like our early Christian forebears, mainly in homes, because they were not welcome in established churches. And together, they came together to found the first Catholic church in Philadelphia designated for ministry to Black Catholics. After dealing with things like segregated communion lines and pew fees and being banned from parishes, as I mentioned a minute ago, church on Sunday didn't provide a respite from the racism they were experiencing every day, like it did for our friends in the historically Black Protestant denominations. So 12th and Lombard in the late years of the 19th century was a prime location for the members of Peter Claver Union to found and open their church, because the neighborhood was in a period of transition and becoming heavily African American. And the church was built to be the Fourth Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia. That's why it doesn't look like what a Catholic church might look like, because it wasn't built to be one. And the Fourth Presbyterian Church had moved into West Philly. Their congregation had moved into West Philly following their congregants as part of that neighborhood transition. And so the members of Peter Claver Union fundraised to raise the money in order to purchase the church. Yet, the parish's own 75th anniversary document gives credit to St. Catherine Drexel, the Holy Catholic Fathers, Archbishop Ryan, Patrick Quinn, who was an official of Beneficial Bank, which was founded by St. John Neumann when he was Archbishop of Philadelphia, doesn't give credit to Peter Claver Union, who raised almost 90% of the money to buy the church building. The funds that came from St. Catherine and Patrick Quinn and the Holy Ghost Fathers only came at the very end to really seal the deal in order to purchase the building. And the document only gives passing reference to Black parishioners whose loyalty and sacrifice made St. Peter Claver possible. Doesn't mention their financial contribution at all. But in order to get the church purchase finalized in order to get the building consecrated and be able to use it, that was essentially the price they had to pay to get their church. What they did get was protective language that said that St. Peter Claver would always be used for the benefit of Black Catholics in Philadelphia. But this high cost that they had to pay, and not just in dollars, but that high cost in the history, in the story, in their contribution, this is what happens when someone else writes our stories. This is why, having that voice is so important. And so the story of St. Peter Claver continues. By the 1980s, the neighborhood is changing again. African Americans are moving out of the neighborhood. Gentrification is on the horizon. And with this photo, I just want to point out that quickly that this is a park that is a block away from St. Peter Claver, and that is newly built. And you see that it's got all of the amenities for children. But I really want to draw your attention to this parking garage, which is 1 block east and 1 block south of St. Peter Claver. And this parking garage was built in the 1980s. Now it's starting to show its age, of course, but it was really a marvel in the late 80s when it was built. It runs the length of an entire city block. It is a mixed use building that is common today, but wasn't common 40 years ago, where we have a retail space on the first floor and then a parking garage above, and in a neighborhood that is notorious for not having adequate parking. This parking garage was really a marvel. It will take research and understanding beyond the scope of what I'm doing to determine if the parking garage ushered in gentrification or was a result of it, but the connection is unmistakable. So as this is happening, the Archdiocese commissions a report. The Sites and Boundaries report, as it's known, was commissioned in 1984 with its final report issued in April of that year. And it recommended keeping the parish open, keeping the church open because it was financially viable because the school had closed and it was within this urban renewal area. It had real symbolic significance for Black Catholics in Philadelphia who might feel abandoned if the church was closed. And the issue of the protective language may lead to, as the report called it, unpleasant complications. Well, Cardinal Kroll, who was Archbishop of Philadelphia at the time, rejected the recommendations of the report and suppressed the parish in May of 1985. Well, that suppression triggered a long court fight, which ended in Philadelphia's Orphans Court in 2017, and where the protective language was interpreted as to allow for the sale of the property. So while that ended the civil court fight that had been going on for so long, the Friends and Descendants of St. Peter Claver had organized themselves as such and filed an appeal in canonical court. So the story of St. Peter Claver isn't over. In fact, just before I joined you today, I saw that I got an email that I'll have to read later from one of the leaders of the Friends and Descendants of St. Peter Claver, most likely updating me on their progress. But, what does all of this mean? This means, the loss of our churches, the loss of our sacred spaces. But for our conversation in terms of higher ed, we have to think about how this impacts racial minorities, the poor, those who are already marginalized. And that an institution can't continue to marginalize people and expect those people to be active in the institution. It just doesn't work. So how does this connect to Catholic higher ed in particular? Well, the story of St. Peter Claver in Catholic higher ed, for those of us who are attached to institutions that are in cities, it invites us in a very particular way to think about how our institutions play a role in gentrification of the surrounding community, and what does that mean for the people that live in that area? What does it mean for the people who are served by the institution itself? is the mission of our institutions being sacrificed on the altar of U.S. News and World Report rankings? I mean, these are difficult questions that we have to ask. Has an institution that was once conceptualized as a school now conceptualized only as a business? And just to think about that, we can think about how the language of business is used in higher ed. The chief academic officer, the chief information officer, and so many others. And this brings us to the question, is an anti-racist church even possible? And my answer to that will depend on the day that you ask me, because I really struggle around this. As a scholar, as a practicing Catholic, as a scholar of Catholicism, those who work towards an anti-racist church must realize that everyone will not want to be part of that conversation. Some will actively thwart it. The folks that I call the unconvincibles, those who bemoan wokeness, who equate being Catholic or Catholicism with whiteness, and therefore say that anti-racism isn't Catholic because it isn't white. Those who want to focus on all the positive things, which really means slavery ended. Why can't you just shut up and be happy when we've still got so much else that's going on? And that one of the things that Father Massengale said in a panel that he and I were on a couple of months ago, that the church will only go to the limits of white comfort, and that dialogue. And let's think about that for a minute. We started off today talking about making folks uncomfortable and being uncomfortable. If our church will only go to the limits of its own comfort, then we cannot do the work that is necessary in order to achieve the anti-racist institution that we need. And dialogue is not a useful exercise with those who are not open to a new perspective. That's when you find that people are talking at you instead of with you. So, in order to really achieve an anti-racist church, doing the work must happen in all facets of church life. Our chancery offices, our congregational leadership, congregational membership, board leadership, education, everything, faculty, curriculum, board leadership. Yes, I said it again because it's so essential. Hiring practices, contract bids, everything, parish life. Our approach to problems and struggles like the sex abuse crisis, orphanages, we're still hearing about, and we'll be hearing about for a while, church-run residential facilities for Indigenous children in Canada. And that's taken on a new level of conversation just in the last few days. And we're going to be hearing more about that here in the US. It's only a matter of time. So in short, we must push our church beyond the limits of white comfort. It's the only way this is going to happen. And I hear a lot when in the consulting work I do, in the nonprofit sector work that I do. Oh, we want Black people. We just can't find any. That is not an answer. It just really isn't. If you haven't found any, it's because you're not looking hard enough. So that's real. So that's something that we need to grab onto as well. And that's also about moving beyond the limits of white comfort. So how can the CSSJ Charism inform this work? Well, as we mentioned earlier, I graduated from Chestnut Hill College in 1999. And as Sister Carol Jean Vale said, Chestnut Hill was a women's college when I attended and graduated. And I am very proud to be a graduate of a women's college. It is a huge part of my identity. And it is something that I don't hesitate to tell people because, as a woman, as an African-American woman, we live in a society that doesn't hesitate to tell me that I don't matter and will not hesitate to find new ways to tell me I don't matter. And to be a part of an institution that exists solely for my benefit, it was such, as as an 18-year-old going to college, it was such a huge factor in the young adult I was, the adult that I am now, the scholar that I am. This is why women's colleges matter. This is why HBCUs matter, because that marginalization and knowing that these institutions exist solely for your benefit, it factors so completely into how one sees the world and how one deals with that message from society. So, so of course, I'm a graduate of Chestnut Hill College, but I've been around Sister St. Joseph since first grade. And so I've come to have an understanding of the charism and what that means, what I've learned in all of these years. And the teaching of self-sufficiency and being ready for any good work, whether that is lace making in France or a college education on a hill in Philadelphia. Being able to teach people how to make their way in the world is intimately connected to what the world is. It is intimately connected to how we go out and do the work. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't hear about the Dear Neighbor until years after I had graduated. But one of the things that I have been thinking about, over the years, and really in a special way in preparation to be with you today, is who is the Dear Neighbor, and how pertinent that is in higher ed. The question demands that we look at things like hiring and contracts and student discipline and HR policies and ensuring that white comfort is not maintained at the expense of those who are supposed to be the dear neighbor, because that is not the work. And if we're going to do the work, then we must really do it and not just say that we're doing it. So I mentioned earlier that the Black Catholic syllabus is something that I launched last June. This period of history that we're all living in calls us to concrete action, and I felt like this was something that I could do. And the syllabus is a collection of resources related to Black Catholics in the United States. It's intended for academics, journalists, educators, diocesan institutions, the general public, congregations of women and men religious. And it prioritizes the work of Blacks in order to center the voice of Black Catholics in the creation of our own narrative, going back to the story of St. Peter Claver that I talked about earlier. And so you can find it, you can Google # Black Catholic syllabus, or you can go right to tiapratt.com, TIAPRATT.com. And so what happens now? We keep up the fight, but do the fight for justice, but doing the work. And that means actively resisting the racism that plagues our church. That means getting into trouble. As John Lewis said, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. My dear friend, Sister Cora Marie Billings, who is a religious sister of mercy, taught me how to get in trouble. She's still getting in trouble herself. And so we talk about that a lot. And I see this work that I do as the modern day overturning of the money changers tables. That's where I take my instruction from the Gospels as I do this work. And as we continue to do this work, we must keep in mind that the call is coming from inside the house. And so thank you for having me today. And so before we turn to questions, we can take a minute and pause and perhaps think about, what do I know now that I didn't know before? So I will stop sharing my screen, and then I will hand it back over for some questions if you have them.
So we will begin our period of question and answer. We invite you to place your questions and comments in the chat. Please continue to do that with your comments. A great deal of applaud, Dr. Pratt, for all of the work that you're doing as appearing in the chat. And so again, I join folks in thanking you for your words and for the wonderful work that you're doing. So we will be launching into now our Q&A, and there are some great questions that are showing up in the Q&A. Our colleagues are actually compiling some of those questions, since sometimes it can be difficult to do several things at once. But I think the first question is, what ways have you found that help students of color feel accepted at places like ours, which may still be majority white in demographics?
Well, a few things. One, students of color need to know that the rhetoric of the institution and the actions of the institution match. Because when they don't, they'll know. And they'll know when they're being gaslighted into thinking that they're not seeing what they're seeing or experiencing what they're experiencing. So, and that requires work. That requires, you know, an auditing of your student handbook, of your faculty and employee handbook. That requires making sure that, you know, when you say that there are specific consequences for infractions, that those consequences are felt by everyone, not just some folks, not just the students of color. You know, students of color benefit from seeing themselves and their experiences reflected in the curriculum. They benefit, every student, in fact, every student benefits from having, you know, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans represented and reflected in the curriculum. And if that's not there, that needs to be addressed by August. You know, students of color in a particular way, but all students benefit from faculty of color being on campus. But you know, those faculty of color carry a special burden, especially when there's only one or two. And that's where cluster hires matter. That's where really putting in the work as an institution matters. You know, institutions put their money behind what they value. So as an institution, you know, what are you putting your money behind? And are you putting your money behind making sure students of color feel comfortable? So, and as I mentioned, you know, board leadership. So curriculum, faculty, handbook, board leadership. Start there.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question, where might the inquiry start as we connect this history to our work in Catholic higher ed? Where do we begin this work?
So begin in terms of materials to learn from. If that's the question, I would say the first place you can begin is Black Catholic syllabus at www.tiapratt.com. And also too, you know, I am working on, it's not out yet because we're still working on it. I'm working on a chapter with a co-author that will be part of an edited volume on Catholic social teaching and Catholic higher ed. And my co-author, Dr. Maureen O'Connell, and I are working on the chapter on race and racism. And this volume is intended for administrators, board leaders in Catholic higher ed, and in order to grapple with these issues through the lens of Catholic social thought. So so that's something to look for. We're working on that with Paulus Press. But those are two concrete things in terms of, you know, reading materials and learning materials in order for places to start. But, you know, frankly, Look at your faculty, look at your board leadership, look at your curriculum. You know, if the English department has a course on writers from the United States and Toni Morrison and Louise Erdrich and Amy Tan aren't on it, then you need to throw out that syllabus and start again.
Thank you. Another question, how do we keep white folks at the table who don't want to be uncomfortable?
Well, those are the unconvinceables. You know, those are the folks that not only don't want to be part of this conversation, but will actively thwart it. And to be quite honest, I mean, those folks are going to try and upend all of this work because they don't want to be a part of it. And so there's, as Father Massaguel says, that I reiterated today, I mean, dialogue isn't dialogue with people who are not open to a new perspective. So the work's got to get done by the people who are ready to do it, who are ready for any good work, as I said a minute ago. And some folks just aren't ready. But what can be done is creating a place for them when they are ready.
Absolutely, thank you. There are a few comments and questions here about the Black Catholic Church and some things that are happening also with our Latinx communities. So the correlation that was transpired with Black Catholics is happening in some dioceses with Latinx and ongoing women in the Catholic Church. Do you have any comments about that correlation in particular?
So, you know, I will say that first, you know, what I do and where my expertise lies is in what I talked about today. In terms of the Latinx community, you know, there are wonderful colleagues who are doing extraordinary work in this area. You know, Brett Hoover, who is a faculty member at Loyola Marymount, comes to mind quickly, and his book, The Shared Parish. There are a number of scholars in theology that are doing an important work in this area. What I will say, and what I try to emphasize in my work, that those of us who are not just racial minorities in society, but racial minorities in the church, have to find the spaces and places where our needs and our demands of our church coincide, and to not let the systemic racism create be used to pit us against each other, because that happens. That happens particularly with the Latinx community and the African American community. And it's important that we understand what is truly happening and resist it.
Absolutely, thank you for that response. There are some questions related to the hashtag Black syllabus in courses and how it can be used, not just in theology or liberal arts or history, et cetera, but in the sciences in particular. And if more and more, but if change is to happen, how do we aim this work towards all of our students, not just those in the liberal arts disciplines?
So I would say the first thing, the first thing really about that when we're talking about say the natural sciences, really to combat erasure. You know, when we talk about, and not just those scientists who have been erased from the history of their particular disciplines, and their achievements and their contributions been erased, but also look at the ways that Black and Brown folks in particular have been used and abused and oppressed in the name of science. You know, the ways that Black women slaves were essentially tortured and in creating the basis of our knowledge of gynecology. I mean, let's not erase that. Let's not erase the role of Black women and what we know about that particular medical specialty. You know, women who were operated on without anesthesia or all kinds of things without their consent, because they couldn't give consent. They legally couldn't give consent. So combat erasure is my advice. In both the scientists who contributed to what we know and those whose exploitation contributed to the information and knowledge that we have.
Failed to unmute myself. Still monitoring some of the questions, and there are some great questions that are coming up in the chat. There was a question, and I'm sorry, as I'm looking at the chat and trying to follow along, I do not have all of the actual questions in the document that we are compiling, but there is an interest in a question. There are a few people who are interested in a question from Sister Joan Lescinski. And if you could actually open your mic and ask that question, that would be very helpful. So please open your mic and ask your question, Sister Joan.
I think it got asked early on and it was responded to.
Okay, fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Another question then is, and we've touched on a little bit of this, but can you tell me if you've witnessed any institution of higher education that is actually doing this work and doing it well?
Well, you know, Georgetown just started doing it well. But of course, Georgetown, you know, was forced to do it well. It was forced to do it. It didn't initially do it well because initially Georgetown thought that they could change a couple of names on some buildings and that would be it. But as I said, institutions put their money behind what they value. And even initially when they started to treat the descendants of the 272 slaves who were owned by the Maryland province of Jesuits, and the money from that was used to financially stabilize Georgetown. When they started to treat those descendants as legacy applicants for admissions, well, I mean, that's all well and good, but you know, they didn't put any money behind that at first. So now that there's money behind that legacy admissions policy, now that there's work not just from the university but from the Jesuit community to put money behind this and doing this work. I mean, that's part of you know what needs to happen. And I will say, you know, the Jesuits are ahead of other institutions, other communities, because the history was always there. It wasn't talked about, but you know, learning about this was part of Jesuit formation. They knew this. They just didn't talk about it outside of those small circles. There were books and theses written about this for years, so it was always there. It just wasn't, you know, talked about the way that it needed to be. So that being said, the history part is there for the Jesuits more so than probably other communities. I mean, there's a book about Vincennes slaveholding in Missouri. But even that's not talked about the way that it should be. So there's still so much work that needs to be done. And just in the last couple of months, and even it's not perfect, but it's starting to be done well in that regard.
You've touched on it a little bit, but especially with this last question, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some insights on how we might use more effectively this idea of service to the dear neighbor, and who we actually consider our dear neighbor as we continue our work.
Yeah, and that goes back to the rhetoric and the actions matching. The rhetoric of the dear neighbor has to match the actions of the institution. So so when you do that, when you do audit of the student handbook, when you do that audit of disciplinary procedures for students, and you find that white students and Black students are treated differently for the same things, well, then who's the dear neighbor there? The dear neighbor is not the already marginalized Black student. In fact, that already marginalized Black student is being further marginalized at the institution. So that requires the hard internal work of going past the comfort level, being ready to do the upheaval in curriculum and discipline and hiring that needs to be done in order to make sure that this can be what it needs to be. But and if you're looking for a one-line answer, if your rhetoric and your actions don't match, then you are not serving the dear neighbor.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm going back to some of our questions that are popping up on the screen very quickly. And thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. Someone here says, I'd love to hear more about how you implement Sister Thea's motto with students in your own classes. That is, how do you encourage students to I come to my church fully functioning? That doesn't frighten you, does it? I come to my church fully functioning. I believe myself, my Black self, and all that I am and all that I have and all that I hope to become. I bring my whole history, my traditions, my experience, my culture, my African-American song and dance and gestures and movements and teaching and preaching and healing and responsibility as gifts to the church.
Yeah.
How do you implement this in your own teaching?
Well, I mean, the first way I implement it is to truly bring myself, my Black self, into everything that I do. My whole self, my teaching and preaching and African American song and dance as a gift to the church, because frankly, it is a gift to the church. I could be studying and working on anything. I chose to study and work on this because the church needs it. It needs me. That being said, the church doesn't make it easy. And half the time, and if you've read anything that I've written, you know that half the time I've got one foot out the door because it is so hard. I implement that in my classroom, first of all, by doing that, by being that. And it is in doing that and being that I can encourage students to do the same, to model for them what I hope they will be, not just as students, but in the world after their days as students are over. And always remembering, as difficult as it is sometimes, that, you know, this church needs me, that I am a gift to this church.
Thank you. And I really love the idea of modeling that for our students. Someone asked similarly then, and I'm going to paraphrase the question, but we have so many students on our campuses. We are becoming so religiously diverse on many of our campuses. How do we use these same ideas with students who may have other religious backgrounds that are outside of the Catholic tradition, or even outside of the Christian tradition? How do we do the same for those students?
Yeah, you know, when I taught my Black Catholics course, before I got to Villanova, I taught at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, which is a Jesuit university. And the middle part of the course is about Jesuit slaveholding. And what I wasn't prepared for the first time I taught the course was the difficulty students would have with facing this, you know, the Jesuit, this part of Jesuit history that they didn't know about. And so, you know, as the semesters went on and I taught the course again, I would begin that section by telling students that, you know, they may have feelings about this, and that's okay. And that whether they are Catholic or not, whether they are Christian or not, there's something about the institution's values, about what the institution says it is, that brought them there, that made them apply in the first place, that made them decide to go there when they had other options. And so, you know, to lean into that, to draw into that, you know, from a Jesuit perspective, you know, what it, you know, whether that is being men and women for others, you know, whether it's finding God in all things. And I know that, you know, Pierre Medallia was a Jesuit. So, you know, those values are very much a part of the CSSJ charism as well, you know, part of that foundation, part of that history. And so I encourage students to lean into those values that brought them to the institution in the first place. And that, you know, this knowledge is not necessarily something that can make them turn away from that, but it can be something that compels them to compel the institution to be what it says it is, that the act, so to make sure that the actions match the rhetoric. And so that is the context for my answer of, you know, our students that are not Catholic or perhaps even non-Christian, there is something that brought them to our campuses. There is something about what we say we are that brought them to our doorstep. And we have to, you know, make sure that we continue to be that for them, and make sure that, you know, that these values can be their values, even if they are of a different religious tradition or no religious tradition.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm looking at our time, and I want to be sure that I don't run over. Are we scheduled till 1:15? I do apologize for not having that in front of me.
That is my understanding.
Okay. All right. So looks like we're running out of time. I guess I will pose one last question in the final few minutes, and that is looking at talk a little bit about sexism in the Catholic Church, because so many of us are coming from women's institutions. Can you address the intersectionality with Black Catholics and things such as that sexism that we often see in the Catholic Church?
So, you know, I will say, you know, again, you can't study Catholicism without sexism being a big part of it. But what I do, what I was invited to come here and talk about was race, was systemic racism. And so it's important not to kind of pivot away from that into a totally different conversation. But, we can't talk about Catholicism without talking about that. And, it is essential, that we realize the role that women play in this church, whether we're talking about lay women who run the committees in the parish, or we're talking about our women religious who built the healthcare and education and social services that are the framework of what this church has become. And making sure that credit is given where credit is due. And so, in the last couple of minutes, to emphasize that, and to emphasize that everything that white women know that they've gone through in this church, Black and Latina and Asian and Native American women have gone through all of that and more. So it is essential not to lose sight of that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. There are so many wonderful questions that have been posed in the chat. I do apologize for not being able to get to all of those in our time here. But thank you again for joining us for this presentation. Thank you to you, Dr. Pratt, for your work in this area and for sharing your work with us. Our virtual reception begins in just a few minutes. Feel free to stay connected and take a break. The next speaker will begin soon at 2:30 Eastern Time, 1:30 Central. And we look forward to seeing you there. Again, thank you, Dr. Pratt, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's been good to be with you.
Good to see you, and welcome back, everybody. I'm Martha Malinsky, Executive Director of the Association of Colleges of the Sisters of St. Joseph. Thank you for Sister Joan and Dr. Pratt for giving us much to think about today. Now is the time for us to be in conversation with each other and enter into a virtual reception. The Association of Colleges of the Sisters of St. Joseph is grateful for our sponsors, especially the St. Joseph Educational Ministries, who is the sponsor of today's virtual reception. I would like to share with you a little bit more about their work. St. Joseph Educational Ministries is a ministerial public juridic person established for the sponsorship of 5 educational institutions founded by the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet in the St. Louis province. The Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet have been passionate about education since the 1836 arrival in the United States of the first 6 sisters from Lyon, France. Their original mission was to teach the deaf in St. Louis, Missouri, founding the St. Joseph Institute for the Deaf in 1837. Today, other ministries and in the teaching ministries include Vale University, Fontbonne University, St. Joseph's Academy, and St. Teresa's Academy. The sisters maintain a prominent presence in each institution, many teaching, holding administrative positions, serving on boards. Hundreds of sisters were dedicated with decades of committed service. Beginning in the 1960s, the women invited lay men and women to take up leadership roles in these ministries. Today, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet of the St. Louis as responsible stewards by further involving the laity in their educational ministry through the St. Joseph Educational Ministries. Transition to an implementation of the St. Joseph Educational Ministries is underway, and a full transition will be in the spring of 2022. More information can be found at their website at csjsl.org /SJEM. Thank you again for the St. Joseph Educational Ministries for your generous support of this national gathering. Part of any national gathering is meeting others to share and connect with each other. So I look forward to doing that now with each of you. We will ask you to break out into breakout groups that best matches your work area for the next 25 minutes or so of conversation. As you enter into your breakout groups, I invite you to introduce yourselves to each other and to share one thing that resonated with you today from this morning or this afternoon's presentations, depending upon your time zone. This reception is short, so please make your comments brief to accommodate for all to introduce themselves. We really do want you to get to know each other and to connect with each other. So with that, I'll have Mary put on the screen your breakout rooms, and please join one of the breakout rooms.